After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
Hey, is greenhouse gaslighting? If I'm not saying something pretentious every episode, what are you here for? Well, come on.
Fair enough.
So, I mean, yeah, like, I think that you got to understand, like, all these parties as competing interests at different state electoral structures. That actually does paint the dynamics of those fights directly. So coming to our next Hall of Shamer, let's get into this
fellow Californian,
and by the is he seriously?
Yeah.
That's
ironic, right? Like,
I think because I always get with John Cornyn. That's the problem. But yeah, he's from Bakersfield. Yeah, exactly. Fellow Californian. And this is also like a historical oddity. Like, this has not happened before, but he was ousted from the speakership.
Yeah. So, the sequence of events of this are just baffling, right? So, to kind of start this, I mean, obviously, when he got into the speakership, right, it took him 15 votes to get in. Really long time, right? I think there were speakers who took longer. They were at points where there was more factitious divides in the country around the Civil War and whatnot. But so he took him a while to get in. Part of his deals to get in was allowing, for whatever reason, the single-member motion to vacate, which was used against him by Matt Gaetz following the fact that McCarthy put forward that continuing resolution to the floor to continue funding the government for, I think, us up through, 45 days, so it's going to take us into, like, mid-November. And Gaetz almost immediately files this motion to vacate. Normally, this requires action within 2 legislative days. And legislative days are not necessarily calendar days, right? Congress was supposed to be on recess, which would mean that there was no legislative days this week through next week. So in theory, he had until, let's say roughly, I don't remember the way the calendar looked exactly, but like roughly like the 17th of October. Instead, he chooses to hold this vote the next day. His tactic, it seemed to be his reason to rush it was he planned on tabling it, which would, prevent it from being used. This vote failed, and he ultimately gets voted out. The first speaker in history to ever be voted out. 216 to 210. All Democrats who were present voted yes. Pelosi and a few others were not there. Pelosi was at Feinstein's funeral service. I think Piltola from Alaska, her husband had just died in a plane crash.
Oh, man.
So was probably dealing with that. The Republicans who voted, obviously Matt Gaetz, of course, voted yes. You also have Andy Biggs of Arizona, Ken Buck of Colorado, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Eli Crane of Arizona, Bob Good of Virginia, Matt Rosendale of Montana, and Nancy Mace of South Carolina, who kind of stands out because she's sort of nominally the more moderate member in that group. All the others, like if you look at their nominate scores, which is another sort of metric that we use in political science to measure ideology, most of them are like clustered in like this sort of like libertarian right corner on the chart, where she's more like centrist on that issue and then more moderate on just kind of more in the middle of the chart period. She had explicitly said that she voted because she had these like more moderate priorities, like ensuring access to birth control. She's kind of been making a lot of media appearances, sort of talking about like ways that the Republican Party needs to like sort of moderate to win back suburban voters. And she kind of felt, ironically in this case, right, because she's siding with the members who are in direct opposition to a lot of those priorities. That McCarthy had like lied to her enough times and had like screwed her enough that she felt obligated to vote against him. And Matt Gaetz during his floor speech, right, said that like the only commonality that like him like members of their caucus, Democrats and the president had was that McCarthy has lied to them, probably repeatedly over multiple instances. And I think that's really kind of the reason why he was ousted, right? The fact that Democrats were completely united in voting him out is actually rather, surprising in a lot of ways, right? The caucus agreed to this, but you'd think it wouldn't have been that hard to win over a few of the, frankly, pretty conservative members of the Democratic caucus. And the reason I think is like, going back to that continuing resolution, immediately after it passed, he was on the news and he's like, well, I didn't think it would pass because I thought Democrats would want to shut the government down. He blamed them despite the fact that Democrats were the majority behind his continuing resolution to keep the government funded, right? Members of his own party have been very public in seeing the shutdown as a negotiation tool, or in some cases just the ends, right? Like where it's just like, yeah, like that seems good, like just shut the government down. It can't do anything in that case, right? So no woke agenda. He had, he's, and even in the negotiation for this, right, was just very obvious, like very clear, I won't give Democrats anything to vote for me. But then afterwards is very angry that none of them voted for him and that they screwed him, that he thought they would care more about the institution. But frankly, I mean, I think he's very clearly made the case, obviously with his, Trump support and other things like that, that he couldn't be trusted, right? The notion that some people had that like, oh, well, he was like this steady hand. It's like, this is like a steady hand that has like cataracts, at best. Like this is someone who's useless in his role. I think he's probably going to be remembered as, one of, if not the worst speakers of all time. I mean, I think the only argument like for other people, right, are some people who passed, probably some like vile, like, pro-slavery legislation in the 1800s or something like that. But I think just as a leader, McCarthy is someone who is completely tactless, completely useless, at almost every juncture.
We even said as much when he got the speakership, right? Like he just seems like he's just like a wet towel,
Yeah, and I think it was like the only reason I thought like maybe his speakership would survive this is because no one else really would want the job, and like we've got a few candidates who've like reluctantly thrown their towel in. Jim Jordan, who would only be the second, he would only be the second speaker who's a former coach with who's covered up sexual misconduct. So representation, right?
For who? For who? Dennis Hastert? What?
Yeah.
God.
Steve Scalise, who is McCarthy's number 2, who I guess would make sense, but he's self-described himself as David Duke without the baggage, which is like, could you imagine like if like Bernie Sanders was like when he ran for president, is like I'm Joseph Stalin without the baggage.
That's pretty tight. That's pretty tight. I ain't gonna hold you. That just makes me want to vote for him.
But like, I mean, if they said that, like, could you, like, dude, he would be assassinated like on the spot the minute that like those words left his mouth. But of course, it's
like David. If someone said David Duke without the baggage, like shouldn't that be immediate grounds for disqualification in a civilized,
like
country?
Yeah, that just insane. Some people have floated Trump's name. Trump has endorsed Jim Jordan. But that's not to say that like if members, I think if anyone forces a vote for like a Trump speaker, I think that's probably officially the end of their party. Like I think that like this has done so much damage to like public perception of them, right? Like you have,
right.
I mean, you have people who are like diehard Republicans, some former Bush folks and whatnot, who are like, we are a better party in the minority. We are ungovernable. Like just self-admitting that like they can't like do their just do the basic job of governing, and I think that says a lot. And
right.
We've seen this meltdown. I mean, like there's been a little bit of a mix on like Fox News, but like most of them are against this. It's generally seen as a sign of weakness and just chaos. that this has been allowed to happen. The interim speaker, who is currently, I don't think he's running for the position, but he was a former like McCarthy goon, more or less.
Patrick McHenry.
Yeah, Patrick McHenry. So, and I one of my colleagues and I were like looking into this. Apparently, the rules indicate that he could, in theory, just serve as speaker for the rest of this Congress. Like he doesn't actually have to hold another speaker vote. I'm sure he will, because I think like the politics of not doing it would be problematic.
Right.
But in theory, he could just proceed as normal.
Something in some of the, like, in how this has played out is really making me think, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Matt Gaetz kind of had to have like his teeth pulled to enable the McCarthy speaker vote. And I kind of feel like this was him getting even with McCarthy. It felt very
it's funny because at the end of it, he claimed that he had gotten enough concessions from him that he ran out of things he could even dream of asking for.
Huh.
So, like, this is someone who you completely caved into, and it still wasn't good enough.
That's crazy. And then just another thought, too, is like McCarthy was like, I think he was in like a little group with like Paul Ryan, Eric Cantor.
Yes, there's a book called The Young Guns, which is
oh God.
What is the tagline on it? A new generation of conservative leaders. Obviously, Cantor was ousted in a primary. Paul Ryan was a former speaker himself. And, dude, the Young Guns also has a Twitter page. It hasn't been updated since 2011. That's hilarious.
God. Yeah, it's like they were their own like variety of conservative, right? Especially like Paul Ryan with like the anti-social safety net.
Yeah.
Politics, but without like the real Tea Party,
Right, and I think that's what I think that book fundamentally got wrong. Not that I've read it, but I know the general summary of it. I think what it generally got wrong was that it identified these three members as like they're like serious conservatives, right? They were sort of maybe like the Republican.
They wrote it themselves, so
Yes.
This is that's the even worse part.
Yeah, that is even the worst part. Well, it's funny too because it highlights 8 other members. None of them are around anymore.
Oh man!
And Kevin McCarthy, according I've seen recent reports that indicated that he's thinking about resigning. That he'll probably resign after the speaker vote, which is funny because he's like, "Oh, that'll help consolidate things." But at the same time, he also he complained so much about his narrow majority, and he's going to make it even narrower by resigning from office. So it's like he's essentially screwing over whoever gets the position. Even if it's someone who's like nominally his ally, because the House members, you don't get to appoint a replacement. Even if you did, right, then that would be an appointment that Newsom would handle, which would damage them. I also did see the QAnon shaman forwarded himself as a candidate for speaker. Which, to be fair, he has more experience behind the speaker's podium than any of those other candidates. So
fair. Oh my God.
Even if it was, a transient post at best. Some other fun details about this. This is McCarthy. He's actually the third shortest serving speaker. One person died a few days before that, before they reached his tenure. And then we have the shortest serving speaker, which I think makes this even more embarrassing, which is Theodore M. Pomeroy, who was appointed for one day as sort of like this like commemoration of his tenure in Congress, because it was his last day in Congress. So
he just got sworn in for fun. That's basically
it. He was served one day in March 3rd through of 1869.
And that was just for fun. Like that wasn't even like anything embarrassing. God.
Yeah. He was they just appointed him in. He was leaving Congress. He was there for a day and then left. And the other guy died. As I think 253 days in. McCarthy speakership lasted 270. But yeah, I mean, this is and it's really interesting because like this is like the whole reason McCarthy pursued that continuing resolution that ultimately ended his speakership, right, was to spare his party like the embarrassment of shutting the government down. Because his job ostensibly is right to make sure that they are elected to the majority, right? It's not anything else. Like, I mean, yeah, it's kind of to pass like policies that they like, but that's limited by the fact that there's divided government. But yeah, I mean, it's this is arguably he arguably set up a situation where his party was humiliated even worse. And we'll see kind of when the next shutdown battle happens, like how is that going to play out? And like, is that going to institute another motion to vacate the speakership if they have to cave in as well? So they've like I think they've demonstrated just how much that party is like just driven by the hardliners, where it's not even like rhetorical anymore. This is like incredibly obvious that that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you did mention in the outline that this brought back Force the Vote discourse.
Yes.
Let's get into some of that. Before we do, I just also want to bring up that like the new speaker who hit that hammer way too fucking hard. That clip of him hitting the hammer was ridiculous.
And when he brought him into recess.
Yeah.
He looked like he hurt himself.
Yeah, I don't. He looks like a very just. Again, he's from North Carolina. He looks like a very this flour is quite parched. Fetch me my fried green tomatoes.
If you asked an AI to like create a theoretical member of the Republican Party in Congress, this is probably what it would spit out.
He's wearing bow ties in our Lord's year 2023. What's going on, y'all? But basically, the one thing that I found funny about him is that he was a Karl Rove lackey and was like involved with Bush's 2000 presidential campaign.
Sure.
And then was also a special assistant to Elaine Chao, who was Mitch McConnell's wife.
Yeah.
So he's been like just a very, very behind the scenes Republican like goblin. And he's just been, he was just patiently waiting for this. And then he finally, he got the job under what seemed to be stressful circumstances. But that's, well,
as I said, I mean, I question how much he really has the job per se. I mean, I did say he can do whatever he wants in theory, but it's very clear that they're going to go forward with a speaker vote of some sort. There's a chance. I wouldn't, it's slight, right? But like, there could be a chance where you get like some Republicans who vote for, some Democratic candidate, whoever they forward as like their speaker candidate, right? Just because they see it as more tenable than having a lunatic right winger, right? Like, and Jim Jordan comes across like he's probably that type. I know he tries to cast himself like he isn't, and I don't know why.
I see malice in that man's eyes. He looks scary.
Yeah, like I don't really get where there's like this weird emphasis that like, oh, like this guy is actually not like that bad, because it's like, yeah, he seems pretty bad. I mean, he was a key member of like the January 6th conspiracy. I mean, there's a reason they didn't allow him on the committee. For the January 6th oversight committee and whatnot, like that was seen as like particularly problematic. I don't necessarily know that he'll be like sort of that like compromise candidate anyways, because I think, yeah, I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see like just how much this boils over with just a lot of what's going on in Congress with that party.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I think they've definitely paid off. Well, let me rephrase that. Mitch McConnell is often, credited with the strategy of we can basically fuck around in the legislative as long as we need to, as long as we pack the courts with our people, But we're starting to see that, like, you can only fuck around in the legislative for so long. Now, whether Democrats take advantage of this like opportunity, that remains to be seen. But I think we're starting to see I guess maybe not necessarily the obsolescence, but like just the McConnell strategy is aging very poorly, like him.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay, I don't want to bring up this discourse again because it was very shitty when it happened. What was it, 2 years ago? I want to say, but
Yeah, it was Force the Vote was 2020, right after Biden was elected. So
right.
the idea that was brought primarily, and I just saw like Jimmy Dore, Brianna Joy-Gray taking this victory
Fucking
lap
hell.
over this the speaker ousted, right? They're saying like this demonstrates the legitimacy of our strategy, that Democrats could have done this and it would have been good. Bear in mind everything we just said, right, about this being embarrassing for the party and destructive.
Well, and also like it just leaves you there with like, okay, so what happens next? And then like,
exactly. So, and keep in mind, so their strategy was actually not what just happened, contrary to what they're saying now.
Exactly.
It was to withhold votes from Nancy Pelosi when they were voting for Speaker until she conceded that they will bring Medicare for all for a vote to the floor. They claim that we've squandered a once-in-a-generation opportunity by not doing this. I think there's plenty of opportunities for Medicare for all to fail on the floor, and the least taken, the better, frankly. Because that's the thing that would happen, right? And then sort of they moved the goalpost, right? It was to get Medicare for all passed. Then it was just, well, it probably won't pass. We'll concede that. But at least this will tell us who doesn't support it. So then we can primary them or whatever.
But you already know who didn't support it. Like,
exactly, right? But their belief was that it would expose maybe people who had lied, right? But like the thing is, there's not a great risk to if you're insincere in your beliefs. There's not a great risk taking votes that you know aren't going to pass and voting for them, right? Like exactly. If you hated something, but you're like, well, my party likes this, but it has no shot at passing, might as well vote for it, right? There's no real risk. Like there's risk that maybe it's used against you by like your political opponents, right? But like if you're concerned about getting your party's base, that the reward outweighs the risk. But yeah, and it's kind of weird where I really don't understand like where they're coming from with this, where it's like this shows, and I've seen now people are like, well, it's the value in it is that this demonstrates power. It shows that Matt Gaetz is powerful and he's using it.
No, it doesn't. It just shows he's relitigating a beef from like a few months ago. That's really
it shows that he's relitigating. I mean, even McCarthy admitted this. He's relitigating a beef that's largely personal.
Yeah,
right. I don't think he cares one way or the other about like whatever. Like McCarthy could have like, instituted a law that like celebrated Matt Gaetz Day, and I think he still would have like screwed him at the first sight just because he doesn't like him and because it's part of his brand. But I think part of the other problem with it is like this is a one shot thing, right? This is, I think, the extent to Matt Gaetz's power. And part of it was, one, it's a lot easier to remove, especially because of the rule changes. It's a lot easier to remove a speaker than it is to appoint one, right? It took 1 day to get rid of him. It took 15 votes to get, and 1 vote to get rid of him, 15 votes to actually get Speaker McCarthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Huge difference in what's actually being attempted there, right? Because you only need the majority of the chamber, which you had the majority of the chamber because the majority of the chamber was what took him so long to get appointed in the first place. But the other problem too is like his career as like a lawmaker is over. Newt Gingrich on like the outside, and a lot of people in there are talking about like expelling Matt Gaetz from Congress for this. Other people, right, are talking about like all of these like sexual misconduct allegations that they previously defended and wrote off, right? Now they're like, well, actually, yeah, like I think this guy was actually like, running around spooning every 14-year-old he could get his hands on. While pumping Viagra or whatever, ED medication he needs to keep going.
Yeah, there's a lot of Republican politicians who have like their share of like now trickling out horror stories about Matt Gaetz. So yeah.
Yeah, and like he like in terms of like having like a brand as like someone who's like willing to like, just toss a grenade and see what happens. Sure, maybe that's a little bit of a victory for him, but like overall, not like, I don't see how you could write this off and be like, oh yes, this demonstrates the legitimacy of our strategy. To me, it demonstrates that all of those force the vote people, and we kind of already knew this, they're all grifters. They don't believe in anything
Right.
principally.
I mean,
And
they're getting Peter Thiel's money. Let's start there. You know
oh
what I
yeah, I
mean?
mean, there's that, but like, I mean, especially like, like if you're like legitimately interested in policy outcomes, I don't see how you can look at this and be like, aha, here we go. This is what the squad should be doing. This is why Matt Gaetz is outflanking the squad on the left or whatever.
It's such a cynical and like just empty headed, but also just like vicious, like a grift, right? And like I'll admit to like buying into the force the vote stuff when it was happening for like 2 minutes.
I think when it started, it was a little bit, at least maybe it didn't totally make all the sense in the world, but I think it had more validity when it started, right? When it seemed like, okay, well, like this is an objective you can get behind. It's not hard to understand why you and others would buy it.
Yeah, and the other thing too is like if you fall, I'll admit to this because like I I believe in being transparent about this, and I'm glad that I was corrected and I you know found like got out of this bullshit very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there was a time I used to listen to bad faith. There was a time where like Brianna Joy Gray was very effective at being like, no, we're going to get very high profile interviews. We're going to have groundbreaking discussions on what do we do post Biden. And for someone who was kind of disappointed after the Biden election, who's kind of disappointed after Bernie loses, it's an easy fucking grift to fall for. And then like as this shitty podcast continues,
Sure.
these discussions are going nowhere. These internal fights keep happening. I mean, my God, you're getting into beef with Sam Cedar over this. What is going on here? And then to top it off, like your co-host, who's still on your fucking like page, is basically accused of grooming, and then runs for the fucking hills. No one knows where Virgil, Texas is to this day.
I mean, she probably does, to be fair. She just won't expose him like that. But yeah, I mean, I think she like I mean I think Jimmy Dore like was always kind of transparent. This is kind of like yeah. Like
I mean, the whole Young Turks like squad basically, right? Like Hasanabi is maybe like the only ideologically consistent one, and he's a Twitch streamer. I don't think he has to be as like
Well, I mean, it's kind of weird, right? That like the person who's like the least held to like some like organizational standard is like the most ideologically consistent of your group.
Right. Like say what you will about Hassan, he's never gone down that weird rightward shift. I think like maybe you can probably,
but I definitely think
you can probably criticize him for being
dubious.
unserious.
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff that he said that like I'm not like I don't like fully agree with him on, right? But it's like I definitely a step up from like I mean the weird like transcript that they've been going on lately. Obviously, like Jimmy Dore and Dave Rubin are like sort of like the biggest failures of their project. As like in terms of like
the whole Justice Democrats thing, like that came and went as soon as it started.
Yeah, and like I think their commitment to it was probably the bigger letdown there, in my opinion. But yeah, and so with Brianna Joy Gray, I think like she was someone who benefited from just a lot of grievance, right? I mean, she was in communication director for the Bernie Sanders campaign, so already kind of someone who is connected to a lot of the goodwill from a lot of leftists online and in like more like people who still kind of buy into electoral politics. But then like she just I don't know. I mean, it's like the more I see of her, like the more frustrated I get, especially with like, as I said, like taking this victory lap over like Matt Gaetz has proven that force the vote works.
It's like it wasn't even the same circumstances. That wasn't even what you were asking for.
A vote was forced, yes. But that's like it's not remotely like what I think anyone wanted. And
Yeah, I think the bottom line on Brianna Joy Gray, Jimmy Dore, and like a lot of, again, the grifter class is like, you know, who is grappling with like the depth of what they don't know? Who do you see that's grappling with like the inconsistency they see? Who is grappling with the just cognitive dissonance of contradiction? If the people you're listening to aren't grappling with that shit, I would say just really question why they're so confident about their position.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's like a good encapsulation of it. But yeah, I could continue.
Oh yeah, I mean that's just, we've kind of commented on this time and time again. I don't think we're gonna stop, but it's like, the reason why I harp on things like bourgeois structures, on party politics, on like institutional power, it's not because I have a fetish for it. It's because I think a systems based
your porn search history testifies to the contrary, but
it's like, it's because like there's no prescriptive answers to systemic ills. I think systemic ills deserve holistic study. I think they need to be analyzed in a historical context. And then more broadly, you have to try to situate current events not as, totalizing indicators of an absolute truth, but more so as either the natural outcroppings or new trends in historical events, right? Because none of this shit happens in a vacuum.
yeah.
So it's like, could forcing the vote have done a thing? I mean, it was a way for people who were upset, understandably, because I was one of these people.
Yeah.
Who were upset about how the 2020 election played out, who were upset about the left-wing contingent of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, whatever you want to call this coalition, right? Being ignored once again. And now, you feel unheard, you feel like nothing's working. And a lot of people, frankly, are, in dire and desperate conditions. So I understand the anger. But the thing is, if you can't situate yourself in a context where, yeah, the left has been suborned by these centrist elements, or that, militancy is very hard to achieve, especially in states where like things like right to work have been implemented, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or let's face it, if you're blind to the history of things like the SDS, of the radical movements in the 70s, and more broadly of the neoliberal turn in the 80s, now you're no better than an old man yelling at the sky. Now you're just like going off of whatever person on the internet told you to do something. Yeah.
Well,
it's
and I think what I find particularly problematic about a lot of those folks too is like, like you were like saying with like, different state level or localized things, right? Like going after like right to work or something like that. I see like, virtual silence from them on those issues, right? They didn't turn their activism or, whatever, supposed activism they were advocating for into anything tangible. They just keep relitigating the fact that they felt like, anyone who disagreed with them is like, not a true, progressive or whatever. And they've, killed our movement, and there's nothing like worth salvaging here, basically. And just keep relitigating that for, going on 3 to 4 years at this point.
Right. And it's like, you feel heartbroken about this thing that happened in the present, but it's like there is a whole history of heartbreak you got to understand. And if you're not ready to learn about that, and more specifically learn from that,
yeah,
what do you intend to do in the future? I think it's very easy, and it's like I sympathize with people. I'm as frustrated about current conditions as anyone can be.
Mm-hmm.
But these are not necessarily new problems. These are in fact like old problems we experience in the present. Does that framing help you or hurt you? You decide. But I'll tell you one thing. Just listening to podcasts, watching these streams, whatever it is you're doing, you know.
I'd be careful. Got a profit incentive to keep them listening.
I mean, I don't know, but like we grapple with like how little we fucking know. Like every fucking episode, we walk in some days like, damn, how are we gonna handle this? But it's like, you know, we're at least trying to be upfront about the fact that like we're aware that we're ranting and we're giving voice to our frustrations, but I have no interest in like, you know, running people into the wood chipper for like my pet project so I can gain some clout off of it. I mean, my God, like Brianna Joy Gray is over here talking about a general strike when so many workers don't have the right to unionize based on where they live.
Yeah.
How are you going to build capacity for such a thing? Yeah, I want a general strike. Who doesn't?
I mean, I do think the general strike argument too is always kind of like mitigated by the fact that like no one seems to have a clear, concise demand to go with it.
Yeah,
because like, I mean, that's like the whole. It's like they see like strike, like it's like the language of like strikes and solidarity. It like it resonates with them, or maybe like they like to cosplay with it, but they're not like, you know, like I mean, you know, we see like these workers on strike, and I get that the media doesn't necessarily cover it in a way that's particularly, you know, helpful in a way to like really understand why or like what their demands are. But like, you know, we talked with, you know, a member of the UAW, right? And he mentioned all of these demands that they have, these clear, concise demands. Will they realistically get all of them? You know, yeah, admittedly, probably not. But like, when you have those demands, you can at least gain clear concessions from who you're striking against.
And I mean, that's the other thing is like where are BGJ and Jimmy Dore on the UAW strike?
Well, I mean, I guess, you know, to be fair, I mean, BGJ is sympathetic to accelerationist views, so maybe she's just in favor.
Again, what does that mean? Again, like, let's. Okay,
so what it is having heard her talk about it, it basically is like, I acknowledge that I'm privileged and would not be affected by this, but I've gotten the equivalent of like an N-word pass from poor people to be in favor of this.
So, okay, Patreon doesn't show you how much people make anymore.
Speaking, she also says something insane where like this shows, in my opinion, how out of touch she is, because she talked about how she has all the support on Patreon, and she says that some people are giving me most of their salary to stay subscribed.
I'm sorry, only so
a $5 and $10 tier.
Before Patreon used to show you how much money someone made.
It still does for some people.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to show
you
that,
have to enable it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for being transparent, but my God.
But even then, right? If it's like, okay, that $5 tier, right? Let's say like her poorest listeners are subscribed to that for $12 or for $5 for a month for a year, $60, and she acts like that's most of their salary.
Okay, so let's just be clear. As of 2023, the 23rd of August. Oh, so this is a site called Graftreon. I have no idea how accurate this is, but basically she set the Patreon stats to private on August 29th, 2021. So looking at our most recent available statement, mind you, they were at 7,000 patrons, earning about $4 per patron, earning about 30,000 a month. About
Jesus,
you know. Yeah, I'd be saying dumb shit out the side of my mouth if I was making 30,000 a month. Hell yeah. But that's the thing is like, you know, on the one hand, Greenhouse Gaslighting is a free podcast that enables us to say what we need to say. Furthermore, if we did make money, I'm pretty sure we'd be able to stay more consistent, but that's besides the point. What I will say though is it takes reckoning. It takes an admission of hard truths and often hurtful realities to build maturity and to, more frankly, have an astute political analysis. I think if you are, I mean, the term leftist is so muddied now, right? But you know, for me in the Marxist tradition, that I harp on, right, is that it takes a sober-eyed view of the world and the systems within it, and the relations of systems within it, to understand how power works, who's oppressed, how do you counteract that, like, you know, all that shit, you know. And then it also takes a willingness to admit when you're wrong. It takes a willingness to admit what your blind spots might be, how those blind spots may be imposed systematically, right? That is a true measure of both political and personal maturity, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think
For
that's fair.
all the people we've spoken about today, I don't think anyone exhibited that quality. I doubt I exhibit that quality 100% of the time either, you know, but
But like, it's an ideal that you're at least striving towards, right? And,
I hope
I do as well, right? You know, it's like you want to, like, you know, do that. And that's, I mean, I don't, you know, I generally own a lot of the, you know, takes that I've made. I mean, there's maybe some things I don't know. I mean, we've been doing the show for a while. There's maybe some stuff that I've changed my mind on over times, but like, you know, it hasn't just come up again to be like relevant. But at the same time, I'm also not like relitigating, you know, failures and like pretending them like they're, you know, and again, I think a lot of it is sort of what I think like her, Jimmy Dore, and like all the rest of the ForceTheVote people represent is sort of this like kind of faux activism where like you're putting your weight behind something that you probably know will never happen or would end in failure anyways, under the impression that it won't happen and that you will never be accountable for it.
while bearing in mind the only thing you did was pay somebody to produce content.
Yeah.
Or as we call it, a grift.
Yeah, like, because like it's like I think like, you know, anything that we've like, you know, I think actively advocated for in a more practical sense, right? Like, you know, maybe like helping, you know, UAW workers or like other things like that in recent memory. That, I mean, I would stand by that, right? I'm not gonna, like, it's not like it would end in anything where it's like, oh yes, like actually, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, maybe the individual UAW worker you could have helped out. Maybe they're not such a chill person or something like that. But I didn't say, you know, help out that specific person. But like when you're like saying like, oh hey, like, and you know, like we said that, you know, a general strike could be useful, right? But we're not saying like, oh yeah, we should totally do a general strike. Because what with that is like, one, it's something that's not super realistic, and two, because it's not realistic and will never happen, it's something that like you can just say and it means nothing. It's not like, you know, they try to warp this into like some like weird purity test thing. Like if you support this, you're like, you know, truly, you know, on the left. But like if you base your like litmus test on impractical and maybe even impossible things, what's the point? Right? Like what's like anyone can just, you know, talk the talk in that case.
I think we've really come full circle with like what we intended for the show to be about, right? Which is like the ephemeral and pervasive hypocrisy and dishonesty, as well as confusion in American political discourse and specifically political rhetoric, right? And I think that this is an old standard of mine I kind of fall back on a lot, which is like, I think a lot of people tend to identify with their stated ideology or their stated beliefs as like a aspect of their identity or their being. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm a leftist, I'm a Marxist, I'm an anarchist, you know, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't change the fact that
all of which are completely muddled in what they.
By the way, yeah, exactly. Very few people can define what they mean by that, and even if they say the same thing, it's still open to interpretation. So I guess
I'm one of the cool Marxists who, you know, believes the right things.
Yeah, I mean, there you go, right? But then it's also like, if you're not willing to admit, yeah, okay, I have these views, but what am I fundamentally but like an American consumer?
What are the practical extensions of those views?
Exactly, right? And of course, it's not easy to put all 100% of your beliefs into practice. I think a lot of people, the majority of people, probably struggle with that, right? But you got to just kind of be self-conscious of it, and just, admit, like, okay, I have lofty ideals and I believe in these things strongly, but I'm also complicit and participating in a system I disagree with. How do I square that circle?
And yeah, like, is that, out of like, kind of utilitarian grounds? Is it just and if you, kind of write the system off, what does that say? Like, are you doing things that are like still contributing to like a better world and like, something that complies with your worldview, or are you doing something, or are you just like kind of embracing nihilism? Like, I think those are also like things that you kind of have to reckon with as well.
Exactly. And that's something that is probably worth examining too, in like allegedly radical people who get into mainstream political spaces, and then it's very, telling someone they sold out is like a shorthand, right? But there's probably a complicated like reverse come to Jesus moment they have, where it's like, oh my God, if I stick to my guns, I'm going to be passed up for promotion. I'm not going to be taken seriously. And you fall in with the establishment, or you fall in with like the powers that be.
Yeah. So, or like, I mean, and to some extent, like on like the establishment thing, right? I mean, I think that I've seen a lot of people just say like, just opposing the establishment is like the goal, which,
okay, but like on what grounds?
Yeah, and it's like, well, like, there's some things that, like, I mean, even, probably even some of the most radical among us probably agree with with some elements of the establishment.
Probably,
a few things, right? Like, there's probably some common ground there, and not to like be too hokey about like reaching across the aisle or whatever, but like there's that element of it, right, where it's like, I think like defining yourself purely like in opposition to something else, I think is not super constructive either.
Exactly. I think there's this if I can maybe summarize this as best I can, it's that politics in America today, especially with how limited our forms of participation in it can become, it becomes more so an exercise in building and proving identity, less than it becomes a matter of practice. And I think that applies to many areas of American life, not just in politics, but that is a discussion for another time. And I think we really ran the fucking gamut on this one. I'm looking at this. We're like a little over 2 hours. I might split this into part 1 and part 2.
Sure. Yeah. I thought it was a good one.
Yeah, I think this was a good one too. So, with all that being said, any other thoughts or any closing thoughts you want to share, Josh? Because I know we did cover a lot of ground. So
yeah, I don't have like a great way to like sort of like capstone this, to be honest. Just kind of like I think, I guess we talked about both some like establishment elements and some radical elements today, right? And I think it's sort of, it's worth kind of seeing that, like, ironically, I think a lot of the more radical elements, right, have sort of aided and abetted some elements of, the forces that they claim to oppose, right? Like, Matt Gaetz, the idea that he sort of represents some real radical motion, right? All he's really radical about is sort of like, just, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In terms of his party, right? Like, I mean, obviously, I'm gonna commend him as much as I can, right? And obviously, he did something that I think is good in the terms of like, destroying the credibility of his party. But like, in terms of like, if you're like actually like someone who's on the side of
it's not party, smart. It's smart politics.
Yeah, it's horrible politics, right? Like, it doesn't really achieve like anything approaching things that he claims to support, other than like, again, like, it's like causing chaos for the sake of chaos isn't something that is to be valued, right? And I think Feinstein, to kind of recap at the beginning, right, caused, despite being that more like stabilizing establishment force, I think caused chaos just through the way she chose to remain in office past her prime, right? I think she actively hurt a lot of Democratic and leftist objectives, just through sheer like inability, right? Like, I mean, I think she wasn't always like the firmest or fastest ally on anything, and she certainly made her share of mistakes. But I think the one that everyone's going to remember is like the mistakes that sort of were just caused by just her being old and incapable of doing her job.
Yeah, it's almost like with Dianne Feinstein, it's like you want to directly blame her, or you want to like assassinate, like you want to chalk this up solely to her character. I don't know if that's necessarily my place, but what I will say is like her career seems to be driven far more so by fate and circumstance than I would initially have been led to believe, and that seems to be both in her rise and
I mean, hey,
fall.
it was ended by fate and circumstance.
That's
too.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It's like, she gets in on this like on this wave by like the assassination of George Moscone and Harvey Milk, and then her career plummets with like her declining cognition and like factors that are allegedly, the prior, some people allege was probably in her control. The latter was definitely not in her control, right? But there are events driven by choice, and there are those driven without choice. The real test of character is how you react to those. That's my final word on this.
And thus concludes our first self-help episode on the greenhouse gaslighting.
I would reckon they're all self-help episodes.
And I think that's a fair summary.
Thanks again, dear listener, for tuning into this episode of Greenhouse Gaslighting. I will share our social media links in the description below. Although, to be honest, just find everything on Linktree. It's in one place. Why would you spend time posting 14 links when they're all in one place for free? Why did I say that?
I was like, do we have an ad?
I'm like, why did I say that like an ad? I don't know. I don't know why I said that like an ad.
Like, are we already sponsored by Linktree now?
Fuck it, Linktree. This was an audition. If you gonna throw us some money, you might as well.
I mean, in all honesty, I mean, it is a practical solution to the fact that everyone has to be on a million places at all times.
Yeah, basically, I will say that like as the social media space tends to get more volatile with like what's stable and what isn't, just check the Linktree. If Twitter's finally gone for good, it'll be off the Linktree. If it's still up, it'll be up on Linktree. So with that, I think I'm ready to conclude this episode. Take care, everyone.